Good evening, everyone. I'm Bernard Schwartz, the director of the 92nd Streetwise Unterberg Poetry Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's reading by Paul Auster. After the reading, Paul and I will have a short conversation followed by audience questions. You should have received a note card with your printed program, and if you have a question, please write it down and pass it to one of the ushers. After the audience Q&A, we invite everyone to join us for a book signing in the art gallery next door. Copies of 4321 will be available for purchase at that time, courtesy of Postman Books. Before we begin, a reminder that our next event will take place Monday, February 6th, when novelists Chris Bachelder and Rachel Cusk will read from their work. A longtime friend of the Poetry Center, Paul Auster returns to this stage tonight on the eve of his 70th birthday, having just published his first novel in 7 years. 4321 begins with an old joke about a Russian Jew coming through Ellis Island at the turn of the 20th century, not as Isaac Reznikov or Isaac Rockefeller, but Ichabod Ferguson, and ends 70 years later with a metafictional punchline provided by that immigrant's novelist grandson. In between are 800 pages of what if. Auster lays out the premise neatly. What if there were 4 boys with the same parents, the same bodies, the same genetic material, but each one was living in a different house, in a different town, with his own set of circumstances? Spun this way and that by the effect of those circumstances, the boys would begin to diverge, each one on his own separate path. The reader follows each Archie Ferguson down his own separate path in the same mid-20th century America. Among the novel's many pleasures are exuberant time capsule descriptions of New York and New Jersey in the 1940s and 50s. Willie Mays' famous catch in the '54 World Series plays a fateful role. The shock of death comes early to the novel and haunts its pages. The boys grow up in the late 1960s, grappling not only with personal grief, but a deepening sense of political consciousness and unease. There's rioting in Newark and a student strike at Columbia. Will they stand up for civil rights? Will they be drafted to fight in Vietnam? That the Archies aspire to be writers, a reporter, French translator, memoirist, and novelist, seems faded from the novel's prologue, when their housebound mother fills pregnant months devouring Fitzgerald, Austen, Flaubert, Bronte, Hawthorne, Turgenev, and Tolstoy. Faded too, perhaps, because the Archies are the invention of Paul Auster, who in these indelible portraits of the artist as a young man returns to a central theme of his illustrious career. To quote the Russian immigrant's novelist grandson, all along there was the persistent feeling that the forks and parallels of the roads taken and not taken were all being traveled by the same people at the same time, the visible people and the shadow people, and that the world as it was could never be more than a fraction of the world, for the real also consisted of what could have happened but didn't. The torment of being alive in a single body is that at any given moment, you had to be on one road only. He worked steadily on his novel about the 4 Fergusons, which grew into a much longer book than he imagined it would be. Please join me in welcoming Paul Auster.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernard, for that very trenchant introduction and very helpful to describe the nature of the book. I'm looking out at the crowd, and it's so big, and it's so beautiful. I think there are at least 1.5 million people here tonight. But probably more, right? What I'm going to do, I want to read the very first paragraph that Bernard summarized, but this will give you a sense of the family and a sense of the tone of the book, I think. According to family legend, Ferguson's grandfather departed on foot from his native city of Minsk with 100 rubles sewn into the lining of his jacket. traveled west to Hamburg through Warsaw and Berlin, and then booked passage on a ship called the Empress of China, which crossed the Atlantic in rough winter storms and sailed into New York Harbor on the first day of the 20th century. While waiting to be interviewed by an immigration official at Ellis Island, he struck up a conversation with a fellow Russian Jew. The man said to him, "Forget the name Reznikov, it won't do you any good here. You need an American name for your new life in America, something with a good American ring to it." Since English was still an alien tongue to Isaac Reznikov in 1900, he asked his older, more experienced compatriot for a suggestion. "Tell them you're Rockefeller," the man said. "You can't go wrong with that." An hour passed, then another hour, and by the time the 19-year-old Reznikov sat down to be questioned by the immigration official, he had forgotten the name the man had told him to give. "Your name?" the official asked. Slapping his head in frustration, the weary immigrant blurted out in Yiddish, "Ich hab vergessen," I've forgotten. And so it was that Isaac Reznikov began his new life in America as Ichabod Ferguson. Now, I just want to mention the name of the ship, the Empress of China, I used because of a reference to such a ship in Irving Howe's wonderful book that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, The World of Our Fathers, which is a book about Jewish immigration in New York City. Well, it turns out that, there was a very large and active Yiddish press here, and not all of these journalists were very fluent in English, but they would nevertheless look at the American English language papers for ideas for stories. One journalist saw a headline in a New York American paper, and it said, "Empress of China coming to New York City on maiden voyage." And then the Yiddish paper scrambled it and published an article saying, "The Empress of China coming to New York City looking for a husband." So I thought it was appropriate, since everything is being mangled up in language misunderstandings. All right, the way the book is structured is that with the four Archies, there are cycles of 4 chapters each. So 1.0 is the prologue, which tells how Ferguson's parents met, married, and ends with him being born. And then 1.1 tells of Archie 1, 1.2, and this is 1.3. Now, the consistencies are this. Ferguson's father, in all these iterations, early on, is in business with his 2 brothers in a furniture appliance store called Three Brothers Homeworld. But Stanley, Archie's father, is the one who really owns it. His no-account brothers merely work for him. So this is 1.3, and the reason I'm reading it is it's a short chapter, comparatively speaking, so I'll be able to read the whole thing without just doing a fragment. So here we go. Just to remind you, Ferguson was born in 1947. His cousin Andrew was dead. Shot down in action was how Ferguson's father explained it to him, the action being a night patrol in the frigid mountains that stood between North and South Korea. A single bullet fired by a Chinese communist soldier, his father said, which entered cousin Andrew's heart and killed him at the age of 19. It was 1952, and the 5-year-old Ferguson supposed he should feel as wretched as everyone else in the room, Aunt Millie and cousin Alice to begin with, who couldn't go longer than 10 minutes without breaking down and crying again, and sad Uncle Lou, who smoked cigarette after cigarette and kept looking down at the floor. But Ferguson couldn't muster the grief he felt was required of him. There was something false and unnatural about trying to be sad when he wasn't. For the fact was that he had never liked cousin Andrew, who had called him pipsqueak and runt and little shithead, who had bossed him around at family gatherings and had once locked him in a closet to, quote, see if he was tough enough to take it. And even when he left Ferguson alone, there were the things he said to his sister, Alice, the cutting epithets such as pig face and dog brain and pencil legs, which made Ferguson cringe with disgust, not to speak of the pleasure Andrew seemed to take in tripping and punching cousin Jack, who was only 1 year younger than Andrew but half a head shorter. Even Ferguson's parents admitted that Andrew was, quote, a troubled boy. And for as long as Ferguson could remember, he had been overhearing stories about his cousin's antics at school, talking back to the teachers, setting trash cans on fire, breaking windows, flunking classes, so many misdeeds that the principal finally kicked him out in the middle of his junior year. And then, after he was caught stealing a car, the judge offered him a choice, either jail or the army. So Andrew joined the army, and 6 weeks after they shipped him to Korea, he was dead. It would be years before Ferguson understood the full impact of this death on his family, for he was too young at the time to grasp anything but the ultimate effects it had on him, which wasn't the ultimate effect it had on him, which wasn't made manifest until he was 7.5. And therefore, the 2 years between Andrew's funeral and the event that cracked apart their little world passed in a blur of present tense childhood. The mundane affairs of school, sports and games, friendships, television programs, comic books, storybooks, illnesses, scraped knees and banged up limbs, occasional fistfights, moral dilemmas, and countless questions about the nature of reality. And through it all, he continued to love his parents and feel loved by them in return, most of all by his high-spirited, affectionate mother, Rose Ferguson, who owned and operated Roseland Photo on the main street in Millburn, the town where they lived, and to a lesser, more precarious degree by his father, the enigmatic Stanley Ferguson, who said little and often seemed only dimly aware of his son's existence. But Ferguson understood that his father had much on his mind, that running Three Brothers Homeworld was an all-out, round-the-clock job, which necessarily meant he was distracted. But at those rare moments when he wasn't distracted and could focus his eyes on his son, Ferguson felt confident that his father knew who he was, that he hadn't confused him with someone else. In other words, Ferguson lived on safe ground. His material needs were taken care of in a consistent, conscientious manner, a roof over his head, 3 meals a day, freshly laundered clothes, with no physical hardships to be endured, no emotional torments to arrest his progress. And in those years, between the ages of 5.5 and 7.5, he was developing into what educators would have called a healthy, normal child of above-average intelligence, a fine specimen of mid-century American boyhood. But he was too caught up in the tumult of his own life to pay attention to what was happening outside the circle of his immediate concerns. And because his parents weren't the sort of people who shared their worries with small children, there was no way to prepare himself for the disaster that struck on November 3rd, 1954, which expelled him from his youthful Eden and turned his life into an entirely different life. Among the many things Ferguson knew nothing about prior to that fateful moment were the following. 1, the extent of Lou and Millie's grief over the death of their son, compounded by the fact that they saw themselves as failed parents, having brought up what they considered to be a damaged person, a delinquent child with no conscience or moral foundation, a mocker of rules and authority, who exulted in stirring up havoc wherever he could, a liar, a cheat from start to finish, a bad egg. And Lou and Millie tortured themselves over this failure, wondering if they had been too hard on him or too soft on him, wondering what they could have done differently to prevent him from stealing that car, which proved to be his death sentence, and how torn up they felt for having encouraged him to join the army, which they thought might help straighten him out, but instead had put him in a wooden box 6 feet under the ground. And therefore they felt responsible for his death as well, not just his fractious, angry, misspent life, but also his death on that frozen mountaintop in godforsaken Korea. 2, Lou and Millie had a taste for alcohol. They were one of those couples who drank as both a sport and a compulsion, a bibulous, insouciant pair of theatrical charmers, whenever they were lubricated within the scope of their capacities, which were substantial. But oddly enough, it was the pin-thin Millie who seemed the steadier of the two, who rarely ever wobbled or slurred, whereas her much larger husband sometimes went overboard. And even before Andrew's death, Ferguson could remember the time when he saw his uncle passed out on the couch and snoring in the middle of a loud family party, which everyone had found so funny when it happened. But now, in the aftermath of that death, Lou's drinking had increased, spreading beyond the parties, the cocktail hours, and the post-dinner nightcaps into high-noon lunchtime sloshes and secret tipples from the flask he carried around in the inside pocket of his jacket, which no doubt helped numb the pain twisting through his guilt-ridden, ravaged heart. But the booze began to affect his work at the store, sometimes rendering him incoherent when he talked to customers about the relative merits of Whirlpool and Maytag washing machines. And when he wasn't incoherent, he was occasionally irritable. And when he was irritable, he often took pleasure in insulting people, which was no way to conduct business at Three Brothers Homeworld. And so Ferguson's father would have to step in, pull Lou away from the offended customer, and tell him to go home and sleep it off. 3. A known fact about Lou was his penchant for gambling. If not for Millie's job as a buyer for Bamberger's department store in downtown Newark, the family would have gone broke many years earlier, since most of what Lou earned at Three Brothers Homeworld tended to wind up in his bookie's pocket. Now, as his drinking burgeoned out of control, so too did his taste for long odds hunches, the dream of the spectacular, once-in-a-life killing, the kind of legendary bet gamblers would go on talking about for decades. And the more erratic his guesswork became, the more his losses grew. By August 1954, he was $36,000 in the hole, and Ira Bernstein, the man who had been handling his bets for the past dozen years, was running out of patience. Lou needed cash, no less than 10 or 12,000, a hefty lump to prove his good intentions, or else the boys with the baseball bats and the brass knuckles would be coming around to pay him a visit. And because he couldn't ask Stanley for the money, knowing his kid brother had been serious when he'd sworn never to bail him out again, he stole it from Stanley instead by putting a stop order on a check to Three Brothers GE supplier and transferring the amount of the check over to himself. He knew he would be found out eventually, but it would take some time for the discrepancy to come to light, since the flow of cash for goods between the store and its suppliers ran on a system of mutual trust, and the bookkeeping lagged months behind the actual exchanges. And those months would give him the time he needed to put things right again. In late September, Ferguson's uncle saw his chance. It would mean putting a stop order on another check, but if all went well, the embezzled $9,000 would be turned into a haul worth 10 times that amount, which would be more than enough to make good on the 2 stop checks, pay off Bernstein in full, and walk away with a nifty bundle for himself. The World Series was about to begin, with the Indians heavily favored over the Giants, so much a sure thing that betting on Cleveland was hardly worth the effort. But then Lou thought, if the Indians were that powerful a club, what was to stop them from winning 4 in a row? The odds on such a bet were far more enticing, 10-1 for a sweep, whereas putting his money on Cleveland 1 game at a time would yield only pennies. So Lou found himself another bookmaker, that is, someone whose name wasn't Bernstein, and put the $9,200 he had stolen from his brother on the Indians, betting they would run the table without a single loss to the Giants. No one knew where Ferguson's uncle watched the first game, but as Stanley and Arnold and the rest of the staff at Three Brothers Homeworld gathered around the television sets in the store to follow the action with 50 or 60 walk-in customers who weren't real customers, but Giants fans with no televisions of their own, Lou slipped out to watch the game by himself, perhaps in a local bar or some other place, an unknown spot where no one saw him live through the horror of watching Mays run down Wirtz's fly ball in the top of the 8th inning, and then even more terrible, the soul-crushing devastation that followed some minutes later when he saw Rhodes turn on Lemon's pitch and send the ball into the right field stands. One swing of a man's bat, and another man's life was in ruins. 4. In mid-October, the GE supplier informed Stanley that they had no record of payment for a truckload of freezers, air conditioners, fans, and refrigerators that had been delivered in early August. Mystified, Stanley went to the three brothers' bookkeeper, Adele Rosen, a plump widow of 56, who kept a yellow pencil in her hair and believed in the virtues of precise penmanship and rigidly aligned columns. And once Stanley explained the problem to her, Mrs. Rosen pulled out the company checkbook from her desk drawer and found the stub for August 10th, which verified that payment had been made in full for the amount they owed, $14,237.16. Stanley shrugged. The check must have been lost in the mail, he said. And then he asked Mrs. Rosen to put a stop order on the August check and issue a new one to the GE supplier. The next day, a deeply puzzled Mrs. Rosen reported to Stanley that a stop order had already been put on that check as far back as August 11th. What could that possibly mean? For the briefest of brief instants, Stanley wondered if Mrs. Rosen hadn't betrayed him, if his heretofore steadfast employee, who was widely known to have been secretly in love with him for the past 11 years, wasn't guilty of cooking the books. But then he looked into Mrs. Rosen's troubled, adoring eyes and dismissed the thought as nonsense. He called Arnold into the back office and asked him what he knew about the missing $14,000, but Arnold, who looked no less shocked and confused than Mrs. Rosen had looked when confronted by the same mystery, said he couldn't even begin to imagine what was going on, and Stanley believed him. Then he called in Lou. The oldest member of the clan denied everything at first, but Stanley didn't like the way his brother kept looking past him at the wall behind his shoulder while they were talking. So he pressed on, grilling Lou about the stop order on the August check, insisting that he was the only one who could have done it, the only possible candidate, since Mrs. Rosen was in the clear, as were Arnold and himself, and therefore it had to be Lou. And then Stanley began to bore in on the question of Lou's recent gambling activities, the exact amounts he had wagered, the total extent of his losses, what baseball games, what football games, what boxing matches. And the harder Stanley pushed, the more Lou's body appeared to weaken, as if the two of them were slugging it out in a ring, and each word was another punch, another blow to the gut, to the head, and bit by bit, Lou began to stagger, as if his knees were about to buckle, and suddenly he was sitting in a chair with his face in his hands, sobbing out a chopped-up, barely audible confession. Stanley was appalled by what he heard, for in point of fact, Lou wasn't the least bit sorry about what he had done, and if he was sorry about anything, it was only that his plan hadn't worked. His beautiful, flawless plan, but the Indians had let him down and lost the first game of the series. And fuck Willie Mays, he said, fuck Dusty Rhodes. And Stanley finally understood that his brother was beyond hope, that for a full-grown man to point his finger at a couple of ball players and think they were the cause of his troubles meant his mind was no more developed than a child's, an idiot child at that, someone as impoverished and handicapped as Lou's own son, the dead and buried Private Andrew Ferguson. Stanley was tempted to tell his brother to leave the store and never come back, but he couldn't do that. It would have been too sudden, too harsh. And as he pondered what to say next, knowing he couldn't say anything until his anger had subsided somewhat, at least down to a level that wouldn't make him regret his words, Lou began to talk again. And what he was telling Stanley was that they were all up to their necks in it and that the store was finished. Ferguson's father had no idea what Lou was talking about, so he held his tongue a bit longer, beginning to feel that perhaps his brother had actually lost his mind. And then Lou was talking about Bernstein and how much money he owed him, more than $25,000 now. And that was only the tip of the iceberg, for Bernstein had begun charging interest, and every day the amount was going up, up, up. And in the past 2 weeks, there had been half a dozen phone calls, a voice on the other end of the line threatening him to pay what he owed or else suffer the consequences, which variously meant that a team of men would jump him in the dark and break every bone in his body, or else blind him with acid, or else cut up Millie's face, or else kidnap Alice, or else kill both Millie and Alice, And he was scared, Lou told his brother, so scared that he couldn't sleep anymore. And how was he going to raise the cash when his house was carrying 2 mortgages and he had already borrowed $23,000 from the store? Now, Stanley's knees were beginning to buckle as well. He felt disoriented and dizzy, no longer quite himself, no longer fully encased in his own skin. And so he sat down in a chair on the other side of the desk from Lou, wondering how $14,000 had suddenly turned into $23,000. And as the two brothers looked at each other across the surface of the gray metal desk, Lou told Stanley that Bernstein had come up with a proposal. And as far as he was concerned, it was the only way out of it, the only possible solution. And whether Stanley liked it or not, it had to be done. "What are you talking about?" Stanley said, speaking for the first time in the past 7 minutes. "They're going to burn down the store for us," Lou said. "And once we collect on the insurance, everyone takes a cut." Stanley said nothing. He said nothing because he had to say nothing, because the only thought in his head at that moment was how much he wanted to kill his brother. And if he ever dared to speak those words out loud, to tell Lou how much he wanted to put his hands around his throat and strangle him to death, his mother would curse him from her grave and go on torturing him for the rest of his life. At long last, Stanley rose from the chair and began walking toward the door. And once he had opened the door, he paused on the threshold and said, "I don't believe you." Then he left the room, and with his back to his brother, he heard Lou say, "Believe me, Stanley, it has to be done." 5. Stanley's first impulse was to talk to Rose, to unburden himself to his wife, and ask for her help in stopping Lou. But again and again he struggled to get the words out of his mouth, and again he failed, each time backing down at the last minute because he couldn't bear the thought of listening to what she would say to him, what he knew she would say to him. He couldn't go to the police. No crime had been committed yet. And what sort of man accuses his brother of plotting a potential crime when he had no hard evidence to substantiate proof of a conspiracy? On the other hand, even if Bernstein and his brother eventually went through with it, would he have it in him to go to the police and have his brother arrested? Lou was in danger. They were threatening to blind him, to kill his wife and daughter. And if Stanley stepped forward now, he would be responsible for that maiming, for those deaths, which meant that he was a part of it too, an unwilling co-conspirator in spite of himself. And if things went wrong and Bernstein and Lou were caught, he had no doubt that his brother wouldn't hesitate to name him as an accomplice. Yes, he despised Lou. He was sickened by the mere thought of him, and yet how deeply he despised himself for feeling that hatred, which was sinful and grotesque, and only further increased his inability to act. For by failing to talk to Rose, he understood that he had chosen the past over the present, had renounced his place as husband and father to go back to the dark world of son and brother, a place where he had no wish to be anymore. But he couldn't escape. He'd been sucked back into it. And for the next 2 weeks, he walked around in a demented state of dread and fury, walled off from everyone by his unbroken silence, seething with frustration, wondering when the bomb inside his head would finally explode. 6. As he saw it, there was no alternative but to play along, or pretend to play along. He needed to know what Bernstein and company were planning, to be kept abreast of the details. And in order to learn those things, he had to trick Lou into believing he was with him. So the next morning, just 24 hours after their last conversation, the chilling dialogue that had ended with the words, "It has to be done," Stanley told Lou that he had changed his mind, that against his better judgment, and with infinite disgust in his heart, he understood there was no other way. This falsehood produced the desired results. Thinking Stanley was now on board, a grateful, trembling, all but unhinged Lou began to treat his brother as his cherished ally and most trusted confidant. And not once did he suspect that Stanley was acting as a double agent whose sole intention was to gum up the works and prevent the fire from happening. 7. There would be 2 men, Lou informed him, a seasoned arsonist with no criminal record, working in tandem with a lookout, and the date was set for next Tuesday, the night of November 2nd/3rd, at 11 p.m. as long as it turned out to be a dry night with no rain in the forecast. Lou's job was to dismantle the burglar alarm and provide the men with keys to the store. He would spend the night at home and suggested Stanley do the same. But Stanley had other plans for that night, or just a single plan, which was to park himself in the unlit store and chase off the firebug before he could start his work. Stanley wanted to know if the men would be carrying guns, but Lou wasn't certain. Bernstein had neglected to touch on that point with him. But what difference did it make, he asked. Why worry about something that didn't concern them? Because someone might choose the wrong moment to go walking past the store, Stanley said. A cop, a man out with his dog, a woman on her way home from a party, and he didn't want anyone to get hurt. Burning down a business for $300,000 in insurance money was bad enough. But if some innocent bystander happened to be shot and killed in the process, they could go to jail for the rest of their lives. Lou hadn't thought of that. Maybe he should bring it up with Bernstein, he said. But Stanley told him not to bother, since Bernstein's men were going to do exactly as they pleased, regardless of what Lou wanted. That put an end to the discussion. And as Stanley walked away from his brother and entered the downstairs showroom, he realized that this question of guns or no guns was the great unknown variable, the one factor that could destroy his plan. It would make sense for him to buy a gun before Tuesday, he told himself, but something in him balked at the idea, a lifetime of revulsion toward guns, so much so that he had never fired one or even held one in his hand. His father had been killed by a gun, and what good had it done him to be carrying his own revolver in that Chicago warehouse 31 years ago? He'd been shot down anyway, killed with an unfired .38 in his right hand. And who knew if he hadn't been killed because he'd gone for his gun first, leaving his killer no choice but to shoot him in order to save his own life. No, guns were a complicated business. And once you pointed a weapon at someone, especially someone with a weapon of his own, the thing you were counting on to protect you was just as likely to turn you into a corpse. Besides, the man Bernstein had dug up to incinerate Three Brothers' homeworld wasn't a contract killer, but an arsonist, an ex-firefighting, according to Lou. That was a good one. A man who once made his living putting out fires, now setting them for fun and profit. And why would he need a gun to do that? The lookout was another matter. No doubt some broad-chested thug who would come to the store fully armed, but Stanley figured he would be waiting outside while the ex-fireman went about his job. And since Stanley would already be inside before the two of them showed up, he concluded that a gun wouldn't be necessary. That didn't mean he would go there empty-handed, but a baseball bat would serve his purpose just as well, he felt. A 36-inch Louisville Slugger would scare off the torch just as effectively as a .32 caliber pistol. And given Stanley's state of mind in the 2 weeks leading up to November 2nd, the demonic, half-mad, out-of-control roar of thoughts that had been raging in his head since the morning of Lou's confession, he found the idea of a baseball bat deeply and perversely funny. So funny that he laughed out loud when the idea came to him, a brief yelp of a laugh that rose up from the bottom of his lungs and burst out of him like a splatter of buckshot bouncing off a wall. For the whole gruesome comedy had started with a baseball bat, the bat used by Dusty Rhodes at the Polo Grounds on September 29th. And what better way to end the farce than by taking hold of another bat and threatening to bash in the head of the man who wanted to burn down his store. 8. On the afternoon of the 2nd, Stanley called Rose to tell her he wouldn't be coming home for dinner that evening. He would be working late with Adele, he said, going over the books in preparation for an audit that was scheduled for Friday. And chances were it would keep them busy until around midnight, so Rose shouldn't bother to wait up for him. The store closed at 5 on Tuesdays, and by 5:30 everyone but Stanley was gone. Arnold, Mrs. Rosen, Ed and Phil, Charlie Sykes, Bob Dawkins, and the absent Lou, who had been too frightened to come to work that morning and had spent the day at home with a pretend fever. Bernstein's men wouldn't be turning up until 1 or 2 in the morning, and with several blank hours in front of him, Stanley decided to go out to dinner, indulging himself with a visit to his favorite Newark restaurant, Moishe's, which specialized in Eastern European Jewish cuisine, the same food Stanley's mother had cooked for him in the old days: boiled beef with horseradish, potato pierogi, gefilte fish, and matzo ball soup, the peasant delicacies of another time, another world. And Stanley had only to walk into the dining room at Moishe's to be thrown back into his vanished childhood. For the restaurant itself was a throwback, a threadbare, inelegant place with cheap plastic laminated tablecloths and dusty light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. But each table was adorned with a blue-tinted or green-tinted seltzer bottle, a sight that for some reason never failed to provoke a small surge of happiness in him. And when he heard the grouchy, ill-mannered waiters talking in their Yiddish-inflected voices, that brought comfort to him as well, although he would have been hard-pressed to explain why. So Stanley dined on the dishes of his youth that night, starting with borscht and a dollop of sour cream, followed by a plate of pickled herring, and then on to the main course of flank steak, well done, with cucumbers and potato pancakes on the side. And as he squirted jets of seltzer water into the clear ribbed glass and worked his way through the meal, he thought about his dead parents and his two impossible brothers, who had caused him so much heartache over the years, and also about his beautiful Rose, the person he loved most, but not well enough, never well enough, a fact he had understood for some time now, and it pained him to admit that there was something blocked and stifled about him, a flaw in his makeup that prevented him from giving her as much of himself as she deserved. And then there was the little boy, Archie, a pure conundrum, that one. No doubt a lively, quick-thinking fellow, a boy above most other boys, but he had been his mother's child from the start, so attached to her that Stanley had never managed to find a way in. And after 7.5 years, he was still flummoxed by his inability to read what the boy was thinking, whereas Rose always seemed to know, as if by some inborn knowledge, some inexplicable power that burned in women but was rarely granted to men. It was unusual for Stanley to dwell on such matters, to drive his thoughts into himself and seek out his failings and sorrows, the torn threads of his patched-together life. But this was not a usual moment for him. And after 2 long weeks of silence and inner struggle, he was exhausted, barely capable of standing up anymore. And even when he could stand up, too unsteady to walk in a straight line. And once he had paid for his dinner and was driving back to Three Brothers' homeworld, he wondered if his plan made any sense at all, if he hadn't deluded himself into thinking it would work simply because he was right and Lou and the others were wrong. And if that was the case, perhaps he should just drive on home and let the store burn to the ground. 9. He returned to the store a few minutes past 8. All dark, all still. The nightly nothingness of mute televisions and dozing Frigidaires, a cemetery of shadows. He had little doubt he would live to regret what he was doing, that his calculations were bound to go wrong, but he had no other ideas, and it was too late to think of another one now. He had started the business when he was 18, and for the past 22 years it had been his life, his one and only life, and he couldn't let Lou and his band of crooks get away with destroying it, because there was more to this place than just the business. It was a man's life. And that man's life was the store, and the store and the man were one. And if they set fire to the store, they would be setting fire to the man as well. A few minutes past 8. How many hours to go? At least 4, perhaps as many as 5 or 6. A long time to sit there doing nothing, waiting in a pitch-black room for a man to show up with his cans of gasoline and his book of killer matches. But there was no choice except to wait there in silence and hope the baseball bat was as strong as it looked. He settled into a chair in the back office, Mrs. Rosen's chair, the one that belonged to the desk in the far corner, which had the best view through the narrow rectangular window set in the wall between the office and the showroom. And from where he was sitting, he could see all the way to the front entrance, or would have been able to see it if the store hadn't been in total darkness. But the gasoline man would surely be carrying a flashlight in his pocket. And once Stanley heard the front door open, the light would be turned on, even if only for a second or two, and then he would know where the man was. Immediately after that, throw on the overhead lights, burst out of the back room, clutching the bat in his upraised hand, shouted at the top of his voice, and ordered the man out of there. Such was the plan. "Cross your fingers, Stanley," he said to himself, "and if luck isn't with you, then cross your heart and hope to die." Meanwhile, he went on sitting in Mrs. Rosen's chair, which was mounted on wheels and could swivel from side to side and tip back and forth. A standard office chair, comfortable enough to sit in for a little while, but hardly a good spot for the long haul, long being the 4 or 5 hours that were still in front of him, and yet the more uncomfortable the better, Stanley reasoned, since a state of mild discomfort would only help to keep him alert, or so he thought. But as he sat there behind the gray metal desk, rocking back and forth in Mrs. Rosen's chair, telling himself that this was the worst moment of his life, that he had never felt unhappier or more lonely than he did now, that even if he managed to get through the night in one piece, everything else had been smashed, hammered into dust by Lou's betrayal, and after this night nothing would ever be the same. For now that he was betraying Lou, Bernstein would resort to his old threats, which would put Lou and Millie in danger again, and if anything happened to them, it would be on Stanley's head. He would have to live with it and die with it, and yet how could he not do what he was doing? How could he let himself get caught up in an insurance scam and risk going to jail? No, he couldn't let them burn down the store. They had to be stopped. And as Stanley continued to think about these things, which were the same things he had been thinking about for the past 2 weeks, he understood that he couldn't take it anymore, that he had come to the limit of what was possible for him, that he was worn out, weary beyond all measure, so tired that he couldn't bear to be in the world anymore. And little by little, his eyes began to close, and before long, he had stopped fighting to keep them open and had put his head down on his folded arms, which were lying on the desk in front of him, and 2 or 3 minutes after that, he was asleep. 10. He slept through the break-in and the subsequent dousing of the store with 12 gallons of gasoline. And because the man who had come to do the job had no idea that Stanley was sleeping in the back room, he lit the match that ignited Three Brothers' homeworld with a guiltless conscience, knowing he was about to commit an act of arson, but not that he would later be charged with manslaughter as well. As for Ferguson's father, he never had a chance. By the time he opened his eyes, he was no more than half conscious, unable to move because of the vast clouds of smoke he had already inhaled. And as he struggled to lift his head and breathe some air into his scalded lungs, the fire was burning its way through the door of the back room. And once it had entered the room, it rushed over to the desk where Stanley was sitting and ate him alive. And there's a break. These were the things Ferguson did not know, the things he could not have known during the 2 years that separated his cousin's death in the Korean War from his father's death in the Newark fire. By spring of the following year, his Uncle Lou was in prison, along with the gasoline man, Eddie Schultz, his lookout accomplice, George Iannello, and the mastermind of the operation, Ira Bernstein. But by then, Ferguson and his mother had left the New Jersey suburbs and were living in New York, occupants of a 3-bedroom apartment on Central Park West between 83rd and 84th Streets. The photography studio on Milburn had been sold, and because his father's life insurance policy had provided his mother with $200,000 tax-free dollars, there were no financial burdens, which meant that even in death, the loyal, pragmatic, ever-responsible Stanley Ferguson was continuing to support them. First, the shock of November 3rd, and with it the spectacle of his mother's tears, the onslaught of intense, smothering embraces, her gasping, shuddering body pressed against him. And then, some hours later, the arrival of his grandparents from New York, and the day after that, the appearance of Aunt Mildred and her husband, Paul Sadler, and through it all, the comings and goings of countless Fergusons, the 2 weeping aunts, Millie and Joan, the stone-faced Uncle Arnold, and even the treacherous, not yet exposed Uncle Lou. So much chaos and noise, a house with too many people in it. But Ferguson sat in a corner and watched, not knowing what to say or think, still too stunned to cry. It was unimaginable that his father should be dead. He had been alive the previous morning, sitting at the breakfast table with a copy of the Newark Star Ledger in his hands, telling Ferguson it was going to be a cold day and he should remember to wear a scarf to school. And it made no sense that those were the last words his father would ever speak to him. Days passed. He stood in the rain beside his mother as they lowered his father into the ground, and the rabbi intoned a dirge in incomprehensible Hebrew, such awful-sounding words that Ferguson wanted to cover his ears. And 2 days after that, he returned to school, to fat Mrs. Costello and his second-grade class, but everyone seemed afraid of him, too embarrassed to talk to him anymore, as if an X had been stamped on his forehead to warn them not to come near. And even though Mrs. Costello kindly offered to let him skip the group lessons and sit at his desk reading whatever book he wanted, that only made things worse somehow, for he found it difficult to keep his mind on the books, which normally gave him so much pleasure, since his thoughts would invariably drift off from the words on the page to his father, not the father who was buried in the ground, but the father who had gone to heaven, if there was such a place as heaven, and if his father was indeed there. Was it possible that he was looking down on him now, watching him sit at his desk pretending to read? It would be nice to think that, Ferguson said to himself, but at the same time, what good would it do? His father would be glad to see him, yes, which would probably make the fact of being dead a little less unbearable, but how could it help Ferguson to be seen if he himself couldn't see the person who was looking at him? Most of all, he wanted to hear his father talk. That was what he missed above everything else. And even though his father had been a man of few words, a master in the art of giving short answers to long questions, Ferguson had always liked the sound of his voice, which had been a tuneful, gentle voice. And the thought that he would never hear it again filled him with an immense sadness, a sorrow so deep and so wide that it could have contained the Pacific Ocean, which was the largest ocean in the world. It's going to be a cold day, Archie. Remember to wear your scarf to school. The world wasn't real anymore. Everything in it was a fraudulent copy of what it should have been, and everything that happened in it shouldn't have been happening. For a long time afterward, Ferguson lived under the spell of this illusion, sleepwalking through his days and struggling to fall asleep at night, sick of a world he had stopped believing in, doubting everything that presented itself to his eyes. Mrs. Costello asked him to pay attention, but he didn't have to listen to her now, since she was only an actress trying to impersonate his teacher. And when his friend Jeff Balsoni made the extraordinary, uncalled-for sacrifice of giving Ferguson his Ted Williams baseball card, the rarest card among the hundreds in the Topps collection, Ferguson thanked him for the gift, put the card in his pocket, and then tore it up at home. It was possible to do such things now. Before November 3rd, they would have been inconceivable to him. But an unreal world was much bigger than a real world, and there was more than enough room in it to be yourself and not yourself at the same time. According to what his mother had later told him, she hadn't been planning such a quick departure from New Jersey. But then the scandal broke, and suddenly there was no choice but to get out of there. 11 days before Christmas, the Newark police announced that they had cracked the Three Brothers Homeworld case. And by the next morning, the ugly particulars were front-page news in every paper across Essex and Union counties. Fratricide, gambling kingpin arrested, ex-fireman turned firebug held without bail, Lewis Ferguson indicted on multiple charges. His mother kept him home from school that day, and then the day after that, and the day after that, and every day till the school closed for Christmas vacation. "It's for your own good, Archie," she said to him, and because he couldn't have cared less about not going to school, he didn't bother to ask her why. Much later, when he was old enough to grasp the full horror of the word fratricide, he understood that she was trying to protect him from the vicious talk circulating around town, for his name was now a notorious name, and to be a Ferguson meant you belonged to a family that was damned. So the soon-to-be 8-year-old Ferguson stayed at home with his grandmother as his mother went about the business of putting the family house on the market and searching for a photographer to buy her studio. And because the newspapers never stopped calling, asking, begging, harassing her to open up and give her side of the story, the latter-day Jacobean drama, now known as the Ferguson affair, his mother decided that enough was enough. And 2 days after Christmas, she packed up some suitcases, loaded them into the trunk of her blue Chevy, and the three of them drove to New York. For the next 2 months, he and his mother lived in his grandparents' apartment on West 58th Street. His mother back in the old bedroom she had once shared with her sister Mildred, and Ferguson camped out in the living room on a small fold-up cot. The most interesting part of this temporary arrangement was that he didn't have to go to school, an unexpected liberation caused by their lack of a fixed address. And until they found a place of their own, he would be a free man. Aunt Mildred opposed the idea of no school for him, but Ferguson's mother calmly brushed her off. "Don't worry," she said. "Archie is a bright kid, and a little time off won't hurt him. Once we know where we'll be living, we'll start looking for a school. First things first, Mildred." It was a strange time then, unconnected to anything he had known in the past, utterly separate from the way things would be for him after they moved into their apartment. A curious interregnum, as his grandfather put it, a short span of hollowed-out time in which he spent every waking moment with his mother, the two beaten comrades who trekked up and down the West Side looking at apartments together, conferring about the pluses and minuses of each place, mutually deciding that the one on Central Park West would be just about ideal for them. And then his mother's surprising declaration that the house in Milburn was being sold with the furniture, all the furniture, and that they would be starting again from zero, just the two of them. So after they found the apartment, they spent their days shopping for furniture, looking at beds and tables and lamps and rugs, never buying anything unless they both agreed on it. And one afternoon, as they were examining chairs and sofas at Macy's, the bow-tied clerk looked down at Ferguson and said to his mother, "Why isn't this little boy in school?" To which his mother replied with a hard stare into the nosy man's face, "None of your business." This was the best moment of those strange 2 moments, or one of the best moments, unforgettable because of the sudden feeling of happiness that rose up in him when his mother said those words, happier than at any time in weeks. And the sense of solidarity those words implied, the two of them against the world, struggling to put themselves together again, and none of your business, was the credo of that double effort, a sign of how much they were depending on each other now. After shopping for furniture, they would go to the movies, escaping the cold winter streets for a couple of hours in the dark, watching whatever happened to be playing just then, always in the balcony because his mother could smoke up there, Chesterfields, one Chesterfield after another, as they sat through movies with Alan Ladd, Marilyn Monroe, Kirk Douglas, Gary Cooper, Grace Kelly, and William Holden. Westerns, musicals, science fiction, it didn't matter what was showing that day. They would walk in blindly and hope for the best from Drumbeat, Vera Cruz, There's No Business Like Show Business, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Bad Day at Black Rock, The Bridges at Toko-Ri, and Young at Heart. And once, just before the strange 2 months came to an end, the woman in the glass booth who sold him their tickets asked his mother why the little boy wasn't in school, and his mother answered, "Butt out, lady, just give me my change." Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
It's poignant that he goes to the Jewish restaurant, Moishe's, and Stanley's last meal is one that his mother served him when he was a boy. I wanted to talk first. I already have the audience questions, and I'll ask a few, and then we'll get to those. I know everyone wants to get their book signed.
Okay.
You've been giving a lot of interviews in the last little while, and one of the things I think maybe you haven't quite got to, or I missed this one, is the origins of this particular book. You, as I said in the intro, haven't published a novel in 7 years, which is not a long period of time, though it's long.
Well,
it's long for you.
But I've published 3 books in the meantime.
Well, that's the
not
thing.
Not novels, yeah.
Report from the Interior seems to lead in very naturally to this novel. And would you talk about that book connecting to this one?
Well, I think the 2 previous, the third book was the exchange of letters with John Coetzee. So that was a bit different. But the 2 autobiographical books, Winter Journal and Report from the Interior, I think plowed the ground for this novel, because these were reflections on my life, and a lot of looking back and a lot of thinking about my childhood, which I hadn't done with such intensity of purpose, I think, since I became an adult. And I found it such rich territory to explore. I think it put me in the frame of mind to write a book about growing up. I don't know, the idea came to me, this idea of the 4 boys, and I just ran with it. At first I thought maybe I would carry them well into their middle years or late old age. I wasn't quite certain. But after a while I realized that it was a book about development, and that the truly compelling things about it were the little boy, the little 5-year-old you see becoming the 7- and 8-year-old, all the way up to young adulthood. And I thought that should be the scope of the book. So it really doesn't get much beyond the early 70s.
One of the audience questions says, how many Paul Austers are there? And I'm wondering, you settled on 4 Fergusons when you were starting the manuscript. Was it 4?
I wasn't
5?
sure.
Was it 10?
I wasn't sure. I just sort of humorously said 9 lives, you know, but that was just impossible. I mean, this book, it would have been this tall, and it would have been impossible to read. And then the more I thought about it, 4 seemed to be the right number. So I stuck with 4.
Something that's come up in some of these interviews was, I think, a liberated style for you on the level of sentence. I think you were, in this book, quite happily cataloging a number of memories, and the end of this chapter has the list of films that he and his mother were seeing. Mm-hmm. There is a propulsion that makes a long book feel much shorter. Would you talk about that?
Well, that's the very word I've been using when I think about these sentences to myself, propulsion. Now, you know, I've been writing for a long time, more than 50 years. And, you know, I've evolved as time has gone on. And I think in the last 10 years or so, I've become more and more interested in exploring the magic and the music of these longer run-on sentences, which I think create a dancing, whirling effect for me that on the one hand seem to mirror the movement of thought, but not stream of consciousness exactly, but just a kind of acceleration, so that I, as the writer, am dancing inside of this and improvising. I mean, really, so much of this book was improvised that I think I hope, in any case, it captures a certain vivacity, a sense of aliveness that I think such a long book requires. As I've said a couple of times now, yes, it's an elephant, but I hope it's a sprinting elephant.
You said you started the book and realized that at that point you'd lived just as long and were beginning to live longer than your father. The experience of, well, how you put it, was the fear that you might drop dead.
Yeah, well, my father died at 66 of a heart attack, making love to his girlfriend. A horribly gruesome way to die, it seems to me. He had been in perfect health, as far as everyone knew. Never drank, never smoked, played tennis every day. The tennis in the book is a kind of homage to my father. who is not Stanley really at all. But this eerie sense that you've outlived your father, you've gotten to be older than he ever was, haunted me for a while. I must say I kept thinking about it. And so I started the book, I was 66, just his age when he died. And I figured a book of this scope, given my patterns over the years, would take me 5 or 6 years. And I wasn't sure I'd live to finish. I kept thinking I'd just be struck down the way he was. So what I did was I cleared the decks. I stopped giving readings, I stopped traveling, I stopped doing interviews, all the things that writers are asked to do, and which I've happily participated in over the years. I said no, and I just stayed in my room writing the book. So amazingly, I finished it in 3 years, and I've spent 3 years writing books much shorter than this. But I was in a kind of trance of this big whirling thing that kept rising up out of me, and I just didn't stop. So most weeks I worked, 6 full days, and often part of Sunday too. And I'd be so exhausted by the time the evening came that I could barely move, physically and mentally.
Was the method still longhand followed by typing up?
Yes.
It's a lot of typing.
Well, if you do a paragraph at a time, it's not so bad.
Yeah.
And then that's how I write. I write paragraphs in the notebook. I keep revising and rewriting until it seems more or less finished. Then I turn to my typewriter, I type it up so I can look at it. Then I start attacking the type page. But then there's a third phase, which is once the typescript has been gone through and gone through and gone through, I give it to someone, a dear friend who helps me out, and she types it into a computer. So I had that computer version always also.
You said before what your focus was on was development. There's the natural development of the boy who grows up. There's the political development. There's a sense of aesthetic development as well. I think a thrill of this book, and it starts with his mother Rose, pregnant and housebound, and Mildred having curated a list of books for her. Mildred knows, for example, that Rose maybe wouldn't be interested in Moby Dick, but other books.
Or Ulysses, or The Magic Mountain.
Right, that's right.
But she might be interested in Tolstoy or Dickens.
Right.
Which she is, yeah.
And over and over again, the different Archies are either from Mildred or from mentors or people who come into his life, beloved teachers, carried forward by book recommendations, music, movies. Must have been a lot of fun, and also, I think, probably meaningful to look back and think of the people in your life potentially who did that for you.
Yes, for sure. There's a thing about novels that I find very interesting, is that very rarely in novels do people read books or go to the movies or listen to concerts. It's as if art doesn't exist. And I've always found this very strange, because for most of us, art is very important in one way or another. And I'm not even talking about, people in the arts. I mean, most people in America like to watch TV shows, but rarely do we even hear about these in books. So I think everything is possible in fiction, and I wanted to put all this in. And certainly for boys of the mind and predilections of these, of course, books and music and films and paintings are going to be a big part of their development.
What about the politics? I'm thinking the sections at Columbia in April of '68, which seems to have been a feat of remembering or a significant amount of research as well. But the deepening political consciousness of these characters I wonder the extent to which you were thinking about what's going on today, and if there are any thoughts you would have on, let's say, how active people would have been in the 60s, how active they are now.
Well, those are a lot of questions. Just to begin, I have to say that they're all different. The Fergusons have different approaches to the politics of the time. Number one goes into journalism. He's also very enamored of poetry. He's a kind of failed poet. He's translating poetry for pure pleasure, but he pursues journalism. He is the one through whom I give a lot of the information about the political and social climate of the time, because he's engaged. But the Archie I just read about, the one whose father died at 7, really is not very interested in politics at all. He finds it very boring. Sure, his heart's on the right side, and he wants the good guys to win, but he's not going to get involved. And the last Ferguson, the one who aspires to become a fiction writer, is in this double bind of feeling a social conscience, but knowing that his destiny on earth, or at least he feels, is to write books and not to lead revolutions. So therefore, he's cheering from the sidelines and not really taking part. So they're all a bit different. So I started writing the book. I went with 2013. So the election was far away, and Donald Trump was not even a blip on the radar. And but something about a year and a half into my writing the book happened. And it was astonishing to me because it forced me to change the title of the book, the one I was planning to use, which I was simply going to call the book Ferguson. Well, then I learned that there was a town in Missouri named Ferguson, as we all did. I don't think anyone in New York ever heard of this place. And that terrible thing happened. And it's now, a symbol of racial injustice in the country. It resonates with the same power as Montgomery or Selma. Ferguson is a place in our memories, recent memories, but it's going to be there for a long time. So I couldn't use that title. People would have thought I was referring to that event. So history was starting to intrude. And the more I thought about it as I was writing the book, the more I felt that in 50 years, we really haven't gotten very far. All the problems that were dividing us back then are still here. They might be different problems, but we're still being divided. So there's no war in Vietnam anymore, but there are other wars, and racial conflict remains intense. And the irony being that having a black president, which I think in 2008 most of us thought was one of the greatest things we had done as a country, in fact, only stoked the fires of this racism that had been under wraps for all these years. And the resentment against Obama, the pushback against him, the outright hatred and contempt and lack of respect for a president, which I've never, ever witnessed in my lifetime, were shocking. And in a sense, this wonderful thing we thought has turned into a misery for all of us, I think, in New York, in any case.
You were saying before the event you're going to be going to Europe and doing some events there. I'm curious to know what kinds of conversations do you anticipate having? You've been traveling for books through a lot of tumultuous times. I'm thinking also of the Iraq War. But what do you anticipate the kinds of conversations, the kinds of questions that?
Well, I don't know. I'm going to 3 countries in March. England, which has gone through Brexit. We all know that. Germany, which is becoming more and more fractured, but still holding solid. And Holland, where there's going to be an election, I think, right at that moment, where the right wing has a chance to win. So I have a feeling people are going to ask me questions there about comparing the populism here that elected Trump with the same strains in their own cultures. I'm just guessing. I don't know.
We'll do some audience questions.
Okay.
Okay. It says, I'm Sana from Iran. We've always been told that literature is a form of resistance, even when there is nothing to hold on to. As we're talking, there are people lined up in the airports being forced to go back to their war-torn homelands. What's your opinion about the role of literature in dire circumstances?
Well, that's a big question. I don't know if literature in dire circumstances is relevant. It has always seemed to me that literature needs to be read and composed in periods of tranquility. The great moments in art history, for example, have always come when a country has made a lot of money. For example, in the Italian Renaissance, there was a lot of money around, and people had the leisure to paint. The Dutch, later on, were making lots of money, and therefore they could support their painters. But when people are miserable and threatened with death and hungry, I'm not sure that literature has a lot to say. I think perhaps those are the moments when we turn to poetry, which I think can give some solace and courage. But I'm not sure reading 880-page novels is gonna do much in those times of utmost stress. I mean, at the same time, I've donated lots of books, foreign editions of my books, to these immigration centers where people have been locked up. And there, people are in a kind of prison, stuck because of the immigration policies of the US. Well, they have time to read. But if people are threatened, they don't have time to read.
Here's a question that couldn't be more different. Having read your books, I can't help but think about the bedtime stories you must have told your children. What sort of bedtime stories did you tell your children?
I was really a lousy improviser of stories, and actually terrible. Siri, with our daughter Sophie, was the main storyteller, and mostly what we both did, but it was 90% Siri, was read to her. And that's thrilling, to watch a child's eyes and face concentrating so hard on the imaginary world you're presenting. But I could never make up entertaining stories. That's why I've never written a children's story, and I wouldn't even know how to do it.
Last question. This is from, I think, an Italian journalist here in New York. It says, in Pirandello's masterpiece, Mattia Pascal, the main character takes his chances and disappears. Would you ever consider doing something like this, living a new life, your own one, but not as established author Paul Auster? Ever daydream of a brand new, pure white page of life?
To tell you the truth, no. I'm married very happily to a woman I adore. And the idea of walking out on that, it would be so stupid. And why would I ever consider?
I think you can take Siri. I think the question was more about...
Oh, I'm allowed to take Siri?
Yes.
Well, then, listen, wherever Siri wants to go, I'm happy to follow her.
Great. Should we sign some books?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.